I also want to talk about CVS.
Okay.
I don't know how I'm going to work that in there, but I've had some truly Kafka-esque moments at my CVS. Which I don't know when will be the appropriate time to talk about that, but I've been thinking about the disavowal, the not reaching your quest, the needing to speak to a manager. That is all like things I've experienced trying to get insulin and not die.
Oh yeah, if Kafka had been American and writing in the 21st century, it would not be the castle; it would be the hospital.
Yeah. My coworker who's type 1, he's been extremely unhappy about his insulin supply lately, and if you're ever interested, he'd be down to grab you on the way up to Canada and do that run.
That's not a bad idea, actually.
He would do it. Also, he's roughly the exact same build as you, and also keeps his head, bald. So
wow.
Ben and Brian go to Canada for insulin.
Yeah, instead of driveway dolls, it's like driveway bald guys. It's us going to Canada to get insulin.
Driveway bald diabetics. Yeah.
Driveway bulldogs.
Welcome, dear listeners, back to the Infinite Library podcast. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm John.
And we've got a very special guest in the pod, longtime listener, first-time caller, author, critic, and folks, they're calling him the Vibe Controller. It's Dan.
Hey guys.
I heard they're also calling Dan the White Franz Kafka.
That's Dan's rapper name.
Do you like White Kafka?
Well, this is why we wanted to have you on. I wanted to cover Kafka, and I said I need Dan for the Kafka episode. And I called him up on the big red phone that we have in the podcast office, and Dan picked up.
Thanks for picking up, Dan.
No problem. The phone is really loud and annoying, so.
We really appreciate you putting the one-way phone in your apartment that only goes to the Infinite Library offices.
Apt with the way this book starts.
Yeah, and then when they talk about the phone system for the castle, it's like never picked up. It just rings. Somebody might pick up. We don't know.
Yeah, somebody might be walking by. Or it might just be left like weeks on end. They'll just leave it off the hook.
Nobody will pick up. So, listeners, if you're not familiar with the castle, a very brief rundown. Basically, our main protagonist, whose name is Kay, comes to a village because he's been hired, presumably, to be the land surveyor. And the village sort of surrounds a castle, which he just needs to talk to the guy that said he should get hired to be the land surveyor. And the book is his futile attempt to do so. And he gets embroiled in various sub-managers, such as the mayor, various families that have jobs related to the castle, but he cannot quite get to talk to the manager, more or less. He's like a Karen trying to talk to the manager at a Sam's Club, unable to do so, constantly deferred. And basically the castle is the struggle of him to do so.
Yeah. So before we kind of get deeper into the book, I did want to ask you guys, you could like tell me a little bit about like your relationships with Kafka as an author, because this is actually my first experience.
It's my yeah. I think mine is a little atypical. Ben, I'd like you to go first, and then I can say actually mine was different because I think I know how yours probably started. Let's see.
Sure. Yeah. So Kafka's one of those guys that I feel like I spent a lot of time hearing about, and as a result, I was sort of reticent to actually start reading him. And you know, I like everyone says like, oh, you don't get Kafka, you got to wait until you're older, you know, like there's a lot of like weird received wisdom about Kafka, and so like I read some of the parables, and I read the Metamorphosis and Country Doctor actually, which is one of the ones that he wrote in first person, which is pretty cool. But I hadn't actually read I think the only book I read was The Trial because that was the one. But Kafka's one of those guys that like you hear a lot about, you get secondhand. We can talk about the overuse of the word Kafkaesque if we want to. But yeah, it was sort of like secondhand knowledge. And one of the reasons I also wanted to do this on the pod is to actually read them, like John said, because I just really read The Trial and some odds and ends. But had never really done it because I think of like, yeah, this like weird, I would say like maybe critical shell that surrounds Kafka sort of prevents you from just doing it yourself. So.
Okay, well, then I called that wrong because I guess none of us had what I would consider like the typical exposure, which is like, I guess in either late high school or early college, you read the Metamorphosis, which seems to be pretty foundational, just sort of like, you know, standard lit canon.
Yeah.
And I have yet to read the Metamorphosis. It'll be the last one other than Country Doctor for me. The first I read was actually in the context of my German courses in college. So, and it kind of has to do with, obviously, you know, he's great. We love him, but he's easier to read than a lot of like the more foundational German texts like Goethe or like Holderlin or something, where it's in the older, more elevated German. And if you want to make a parallel, you kind of say like the way people talk about Hemingway for English, like a more simplified, natural English and less ornamented. Mm-hmm. And Kafka kind of marks like, more matter of fact, clipped, modern and bureaucratic, or at least sort of like standardized, officialized German. And you could kind of read that into like the way that his people often bring in his work with the insurance corporation and just the general themes of bureaucracy and organization and record keeping.
Yeah, Dan, would you say it's like workplace German?
In the way that I think a lot of languages developed into that more efficient form of themselves in the early 20th century. Just, you know, like office language, where it's like, we need communication to be clear, direct. We don't need it to be florid, like we loved with all the romantics and stuff like that. Like it's much more direct, to the point. And I do think that like for people who are familiar with just American or English language lit and the way we think about like when did prose change, I think Hemingway is kind of a good touchstone because it is, it's a similar sort of like, he's not doing avant-garde things with his prose, but it is kind of noticeably new and unornamented. And you get the crazy constructions, like the super long sentences, you know. Sometimes I would just track how long the sentences were, like start highlighting something and then you realize, oh, I'm ending up with a half the page here. But yeah, it just feels very modern in terms of prose. So I guess going back to my introduction, that makes him a good thing to read when you are at the level where you can actually read like a decent book in German instead of one made for children. And
right.
So we started out with the really short stuff, the parables, 4 Dame Gazettes before the law is kind of like great because it's like 2 pages long, but there's a lot to analyze. So when you're just getting to, you know, Mittelstufe Deutsch, like, you know, intermediate German where you can actually kind of get through a book and make sense of it. I think he's great. And so in the context of those classes, I read the short stuff, the trial, then on my own afterwards, I read America and Now the Castle. So that leaves you with Metamorphosis, which I think is, as I said, where most people come in. And I think that'll feel like, going back to an artist's early stuff, where now I know where he ended up, literally on his deathbed, and go back to his earliest.
The original hits.
I've loved him. Definitely reading him in like late college and afterwards was really feeling. I don't know if I needed the experience to really get the intention and what's grimly funny about it, but it definitely it hit.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's cool. I appreciate both of you guys sharing like your stories there with me. I think it's interesting, like you said, Dan, none of us have like a typical like experience with him. He's somebody that, kind of like you were saying, Ben, like I feel like I've heard about him for so long that I think everybody has authors like this. You hear about them so much, like these canonical people, that you're like, I don't really need to get to that right now. I kind of know exactly what his thing is. So there's probably more pressing things for me to get to. But I think with Kafka, it's interesting. He has like a really interesting place in the canon in a way, in that he's this guy who, I think the reason why so many people like him so much is that he feels like almost kind of a prophetic author. It feels like he was like on this tip that really nobody else was doing kind of exactly the same thing yet. But then like 50 years later, or more than 50 years later, kind of post World War II, I feel like he's so influential on people like Pynchon and a lot of those guys that he feels like this antecedent of so much like modern lit that he takes on this almost outsized status because
kind of a ghost that like his lack of career in his life, and then now he seems to underpin so much of like anything postmodern just because it is all these systems are still super familiar to us, and it feels like you said prophetic, because like the things that he's writing about here with like paper documents, I mean, when you extrapolate that to like this digital landscape of just madness, like it works perfectly. It's the continuation of the curve, really. He's there and everything for sure.
Yeah, and in some ways, like the file becomes more important than the person themselves, which is just as applicable to our like digital online identities versus our real identities. Like, like the sort of copy or the record or the written note. Also, I feel like absent centers are big. That's the Kafka's thing. You never quite get to where you're supposed to go. And two, I think Anna would probably agree with me unless I'm wrong, but like, magical realism in Kafka, but only because like, I think in the Metamorphosis, it's like one day he wakes up and he's a giant like rodent / bug. And that's almost it. I feel like he doesn't really do a lot of magical realism, but like that has like such an outsized influence that like he sometimes shows up in like, what are the early magical realist authors?
Yeah, I kind of was almost like, I kept waiting for something like flashier to happen in this book. Like I didn't really know what to expect going into it. I'll be totally frank. I didn't even know when I started reading this. I did kind of a minimum of like supplementary reading beforehand. And I like didn't even know that it ended. It didn't have an ending. I started it.
Which I think is honestly fitting. We don't have to jump in now,
absolutely,
but like the fact that he never gets to the castle and the book never ends, like I don't know, that works for me.
As I was saying earlier in pre-show, like in my edition, the way there's like multiple staggered non-endings, like here's where the original text ended, here's the continuation of the manuscript, here is the supplementary stuff, and you could read all of it and it still never actually ends. It's all still unfinished in every piece, no matter how much of it you add together.
Yeah, so for our listeners, if you aren't aware, this is the kind of the last thing we know Kafka was working on before he died of tuberculosis as a fairly young man. And so it basically ends mid-sentence. And
he didn't intend to finish it.
it's basically,
some
we have
time.
kind of this manuscript that he never intended to have published, and maybe that's kind of a good place to
Yeah.
discuss like the way that like this is the only thing he had, like this is the closest thing he has to like a novel, right? Like everything else is a lot shorter than this. If
I feel like the trial
America's got some decent length as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
I could be wrong there. I feel like I've always like come across him more as like a writer of short fiction is how he's usually described. He's not described as a novelist very often.
It's kind of two channels. Yeah, he's got the ultra short aphorism stuff, which actually in one of my German class texts, it was he had a few of the aphorisms that were bound into this text we had called Kurzestgeschichten, which means so essentially shortest stories. It's essentially all flash fiction, 1 to 2 pages, but so you get like Before the Law in there. So he's got a lot of the ultra short, and Metamorphosis is definitely like a novella. And then you've got the novels as well. But
it looks like Trial's like under 200 pages. So
they're kind of siloed.
So this is definitely like his longest work, so to speak. Now, I feel like part of that length is the fact that this clearly, like, as someone who again like writes in my own time, like this reads like a manuscript that did not have like a full edit done. Like, there's clearly a lot here that I think would have probably ended up on the cutting room floor had it.
Yeah, when you get to Amelia's story like walls you in. Like it's like he starts talking to somebody and they tell their experiences of trying to get to the castle, and like it's almost oppressive how much it just kind of walls you into Amelia's story, and there's no like, you almost forget about Kay for a while at that point. And like you said, John, I wonder if that would get edited if it had a pass.
Yeah, the Olga section, it almost feels like an inserted narrative, like like Steppenwolf, where he like picks up the brochure and then you get 40 pages of that. I mean, we're in Olga's story for probably 30-40 pages. So it's it definitely does have an unfinished quality to it. You forget it at times because there is some like truly stellar stuff just in how he's constructing. We'll get into the symbolism, but the very dense loading of just like hyper analysis and really communicating just that everybody is maneuvering, everybody's sizing up everyone, trying to read everything out of any expression, movement, thing done or left undone. And he's really on fire in some parts, and I think he ultimately, like, if he hadn't been dying, he might have felt like, I can finish this, but the way it was left, it's not like he was in the middle of writing it and then died. I think he kind of gave up, realizing that he wouldn't be able to get it to a finished point before he died, which is a shame, because I think it really could have been sort of his like masterwork if it had been polished, because I think we should talk about the parallels to especially the trial. I think there's a lot of parallels there. Because, namely, both narrators are named Kay. But
and the summons, like in the trial, he is summoned, and he begins to act as if he is guilty, even though it is unclear that he's done anything wrong.
Exactly.
And then with the castle, he acts as if he's the land surveyor, when it's sort of implied that he may not be. Like,
I think it's
there's sort
implied,
of like a weird, like, there's a weird ambiguity.
But like not only the summons, but also the you have to. You're fighting to find out what your crime even is, much less get forgiven. And so I think had the potential to be like something incredible, but as we know, he really didn't have the career that this necessarily would have like had an audience and taken off, even if he had lived to publish it. So.
And I find it interesting too that the ending is like given secondhand, in that you have to like read about it elsewhere. And it's like Kafka told, I think, Brod that like the end was going to be like, it's like he finally hears back from the castle. They don't confirm if he's the land surveyor, but they say, you can live here.
Yeah, just living in limbo for the rest of his life, which is like,
Yeah.
Once you're deep into the novel, that's just sort of like a horrifying thing, given how like tense the situation is after like 2 weeks. Just sort of a madness that if you extrapolate that out to like the rest of his life, just sort of like always hanging in the balance. I mean, it's like a hell, it's
Yeah, I think something that is really interesting with this book, because again, like my knowledge of Kafka is, again, like I knew him as kind of like the guy, like he writes about bureaucracy, he writes about like the relation of the subject to like the state and like kind of these big impersonal frameworks. But something that I found really interesting in this book, because it does like focus in on this like very small, like basically like peasant town and somewhere like in rural Germany, presumably,
Bohemia,
and it really like has this kind of very like it really shows like the hell of like being trapped in like this small community
in winter
in a way that's very intimate. Not so much as some that like with Kay as an outsider, but also like you kind of get the feeling from some of these characters, it's like, oh man, like your life sucks because you had to live in this like this weird town your whole life. And like you were saying, Dan, like everyone's constantly like scheming and like trying to get over on everybody else. And then you have the castle kind of looming over everything. And there's definitely something about kind of the oppression of like being in a small place that felt kind of unexpected to me.
I don't think it's ever mentioned involving anyone other than Kay, the idea of going elsewhere. Like, people ask like, why don't you just go away? And he's like, no, I'm going to stay. But for anyone else, there's no question of like, no matter how miserable their life has been in what seems to be a pretty bleak place, you just, it's the middle of winter. Everybody's stumbling through snow. It's foggy. It's cold. Nobody's ever outside. But none of these characters, it's all, you have to stay. It's the only place worth being, like, because we have the castle. Like, I could maybe get there someday, or at least closer. Or you could just go somewhere else.
And Frida, so he eventually ends up in one of the scenes kind of sleeping with a barmaid. And at one point, Frida does suggest to him, why don't we leave? We could go somewhere else. Yeah. And Kay only hears the fact that she had a relationship with Clam, who we have not talked about. Clam is like this like godlike higher castle authority that like people only peep at through peepholes. Like nobody like interacts with him directly. But like Kay was like, if Frida knows Clam, then maybe I could get closer to the castle. And so like when they're in this relationship, she's like pleading with him to do something. Like, why don't we leave? We could do other stuff. And he doesn't care.
And even when people do see Clam, it's they're unsure if they're seeing the same person. It ends up being like it was probably him. I mean, he kind of dressed like him. He didn't look quite the same this time, but like
that guy looked really important. It must have been Clam.
Even after all the difficulty of getting to see him through a peephole, it's like, it could be him. That's throughout just how effectively he makes everything so ambiguous, where you have to believe something or you can't operate, but you have worse than shaky information and the stakes are so high that like it's just terrifying. Everything is fraught because you can't trust the tools that you have, but they're all you have to make any progress here.
Like he gets that first letter from Clam, and there's like, as you were talking about, there's like a huge sentence that's him interpreting the letter, and like his interpretation of the letter is just like, maybe you could work here. It's like there's no there's like no solid proof, but you get like a long block of analysis for just this like sort of random sounding, not random, but like business sort of speak letter.
Yeah, did he leave a window open anywhere in here by like phrasing things a certain way? And I
was gonna say maybe this is like a good place to like talk about Kay a little bit as a protagonist, because he is like, again, there is this interesting element here where, like you were saying, Dan, the whole book is really kind of about you can't trust what Kay is seeing. Kay it's not in first person, but we never fully leave his perspective, even like when other characters are narrating like their pasts. Like we're still kind of supposed to be like in Kay's shoes. But K is like basically a blank slate as well. Like there's no real mention of his past. Like Ben said earlier, like even though he's ostensibly here to be the land surveyor, we don't know if that's actually true.
He comes off the road and we don't know anything more. He'll occasionally, we do get a flashback to his childhood. There was a church in the town he grew up in. That's about as much as we get.
Wow, a church in Germany?
But
crazy.
I think it's a good place to, since the trial, the narrator is also just K. We have a very big difference in the two Ks, where in the trial, it's in the first line, it's established that he has been wronged because it's, one day without having done anything wrong, K was, accused essentially. And so you're told he's innocent in the first line. And over the course of the castle, you really get the sense that K is like pretty slimy and is manipulating everyone, probably misrepresenting himself. We never get what his angle is. Like, there doesn't seem to be much to gain by coming here, yet he refuses to leave. And so, the two Ks, we have the innocent one in the trial who is being, oppressed, wronged by the system, and this K who he's kind of coming in trying to game it, thinking maybe as an outsider he can play it. But he is very much a blank slate. It's almost as if he is keeping his cards very close to his chest, just because, like, if people know anything about you, they might just make a snap decision about you and it's all over. Everything you've tried has been established because, like, oh, you're from Prague. Well, anyone who comes from Prague is just coming to meddle in things here, and you just be closed out forever. So you got to stay a mystery, because if they think, well, maybe he's someone we should worry about versus just instantly writing you off, at least you have a chance. Kay becomes like pretty slimy over the course, the way he treats Frida. Like, he's big time male manipulator for sure.
And how he treats the poor assistants. He can't take a joke.
The poor assistants, by the way, is like so funny because I just imagine and they get named later, but it's like two indiscriminate guys who are constantly running around and like falling over and like being generally incompetent.
He can't take their bits at all. He cannot abide by their buffoonery. It's just, there is honestly a lot of comic relief in the book throughout, and
it's a very funny book.
Well, and as I think it's in Thomas Mann's introduction too. I think all of our editions had that, maybe, but he mentions that in readings where Kafka was reading his manuscript to his friends, everybody was just howling in laughter. Like, it was hilarious.
Well, I have an addendum to that. So Milan Kundera says, and he's speaking from personal experience, he's like, you read Kafka the first time with a sense of tragedy and moral seriousness, and then you hear that he would read stuff and everybody would laugh, and then you would read it and go, where's the humor? And you would go too far in the other direction, according to Kundera, and he's it's somewhere in between. It is funny, but it's also tragic.
There's horror in it for sure. Just the almost sort of like the very end of Twin Peaks: The Return, where it's just, you have that sense of it doesn't end. You can't win. Or also Gravity's Rainbow, the whole idea of Counterforce being a failure from the start. Just no, you're still within their system. You're always going to lose if they want you to lose.
I feel like it's also again, kind of the way that he is been made into this prophet of modernity. That kind of, I think, increases his sort of reputation as a tragic or quasi horror writer, because we kind of see he's presaging the horrors that come later in the 20th century in this very weird way. I don't want to overstate to be Kafka presages the camps, but I feel that is kind of the critical reception to some degree. And so I think that it's very easy to lose the humor when you don't kind of know that it's supposed to be funny. But Kafka definitely strikes me as a guy who he obviously suffered through a lot of kind of indignity in his life and was tormented by his sexual urges and his menial employment and all that stuff. But he seems like
Miserable
someone
health.
who who managed to he probably found a lot of comedy, like black comedy in his circumstances as well. Like I don't get the impression he was like someone who was down on himself all the time. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think he was kind of tormented in the way that you can see his characters make things harder emotionally for themselves, just hyperanalyzation. But I mean, he had friends. He was in a semi-literate, or I mean, literate in that they could read, but like literary circle.
Yeah.
Even though he didn't have a particularly successful career. I was just going to say, his miserable health it was a slow death from tuberculosis. He struggled with it for a pretty good long time. And also, I think like kind of bridging the if you want to call it a type of horror, it's bureaucratic horror, and it's hard to sort of like parse that. But I think it's easier to parse that if you look at the specifics of his employment, where he worked for like the state workers insurance. So it's like he's essentially it's horrific industrial accidents, someone's arm getting ripped off in a weaving machine or a power loom or something, and he sees it translated into forms and paperwork.
Yeah. And speaking of comedy too, like when they go to see the mayor and the mayor has no organization for his papers. And at one point, like there's this scene where the assistants have like laid a filing cabinet on the side and are like jumping up and down on it to get like all of the papers like into the filing cabinet. And like the mayor has gout and he's like sitting in bed and he's like having this like buffoonish interpretation of like this personal letter. Like it's like the paperwork is like both funny and also like horrific when it comes to stand in for the person.
Because in that scene, they're looking for what's a vital document for Kay's case. So with these papers just getting thrown around, and we see that in the Herrenhof later with the distribution of the files. Sometimes like you got to get rid of them all. So sometimes they just get ripped up, like they got all be gone. But, since Kay's file that they're looking for is really important, the idea is like any one of these papers that they're just cramming into the cabinet in no order could be life or death for any of the people who are just petitioning endlessly. And it's just like, no, this is how it ends. It just gets lost. It doesn't matter to anyone, but it's your existence.
I think too with Kafka, Dan, you made a really interesting parallel when we were kind of talking before we started recording. You drew a parallel between Kafka and like kind of Jewish American comedy, like film comedy. And there is kind of this like, I feel like there's an element there as well, where it's almost kind of this Larry David-esque like exasperation with kind of the just daily ways you're just kind of put through the ringer and there's no way out of it. And so you just kind of have to be exasperated with the absurdity.
Well, yeah, I had mentioned this before, but in After Hours, which is by Scorsese, the screenplay just does Before the Law. So he's like trying to get into a nightclub and he's like, can I go in? And he goes, you can't go in right now, maybe later. And it's like, well, how long is it going to take? Like, it'll happen when it happens. And then he's like, do you have any money? And he goes, oh, finally, like you could have just told me. And he gives him the money and he goes, I don't want you to feel like you haven't tried everything.
May I enter?
I can't let you in at the moment.
Will it be possible to be admitted at a more convenient time for the club?
It is possible, but not at the moment. If you're so drawn to it, try and force your way in. Got any money?
Yes, I have money. Is that what you want? Money? Why didn't you just ask for that in the first place, man? Here, it's not much, but it's all I've got.
I'll take your money because I don't want you to feel you left anything untried.
Yeah.
And so like he gives him the money and like nothing happens.
Yeah.
So
you need to
like,
feel that you're at least trying towards the struggle. Let them spin their wheels. They'll tire themselves out and they'll feel better.
And honestly, I made this crack earlier, but like sometimes you go to CVS and the person goes, "Who are you?" And you're like, "I've been here every like 2 weeks. What do you mean you don't know who I am?" And he goes, "Have you been in here before?" I'm like, "Yes." Like, I don't know. There's like, and CVS obviously is like not run as well as it could be for various reasons that are beyond my control. But my experience with the CVS is identical to the land surveyor sometimes.
Let's go into
so
this, Ben. Let's do the CVS dive.
All I'm saying is like so you go into CVS and U2 is playing, and I finally found what I'm looking for, or Desire, or some U2 song is playing, and somebody comes up to you and they says, "I don't know where your file is." Like, and you're like, "You've been in here 2 weeks. Like you know who I am. I get the same medicine from this institution." So then I'm like talking to 2 separate people, and eventually someone's like, "Oh, somebody accidentally deleted your file," and I was like, "Oh, okay." like that's, I'm glad, but anyway, I don't know. The CVS is I don't know if you guys have spent time in the CVS, but it's the best we got, and it's very in many ways reminiscent of the castle, if you ask me. So,
but Castle, Village, I don't know, CVS.
Oh, and the U2 to me adds
Castle,
to the purgatory.
Schloss.
Yeah, U2 is a very Kafka-esque when you look at just biggest band in the world, the phony humanitarianism. Just the songs that are very aspirational and huge, and then just like the shallowest man alive
at the center of it.
God, Ben, maybe it was you who told me this recently, but the stories of Bono just walking around in Dublin and showing up to people's house and being like, "I'm in your house. You want to see me? I'm Bono." like it's a gift.
I'm the only famous Irish person left.
Well, there's also a story of him going to see Junior Kimbrough and being scared. like Junior Kimbrough, they go, "This is U2," and he goes, "You too, me too." Like, and then he plays like a blues song about killing somebody, and Bono's like, "I'm scared. I don't want to be here anymore." But
oh man.
But yeah, as you were saying, John, I think there's like, Jewish comedy also just like sort of dealing with institutions that, aren't designed to function well because of just the way they were set up. I think there's a lot of modern parallels between what Kafka was talking about and now.
Yeah, I guess there's almost kind of like this like, I don't want to like go so far as to be like, oh, Kafka, anti-capitalist writer, like. I don't want to be that guy, but I do feel like there is kind of this interesting thing where, like the castle, like again, the castle, it's literally a castle. Like it's this huge old like medieval like fortress that these like weird men like who basically lord over this village like just are sequestered in, and like they're running kind of everything for their own benefit. And the messiness and kind of chaos that exists below them is like very much like to keep everyone busy so that they can keep like running things.
Yeah, and everyone's really internalized that process. Just like they have pity for the officials who have it way better than them and control, every aspect of their lives. It's just like we really need to just make it easy on them. These men cannot be disturbed. Do you see how stressed out they are? Like if they're asleep and they sleep through the meeting that they called you to, it's only because like their work is so hard that they're just exhausted. And you should take that as a good sign, because like if they ever do help you, they'll work really hard on it.
and like there's so many like minor secretaries, and like towards the end, Kay has a dream about fighting a secretary
as a Greek
like
god.
In combat. Like can we talk about that scene? Because I still have no idea what's going on in that. Like he's like dreaming, and one of the secretaries is like watching him fall asleep and like talking, and then he imagines like fighting a guy. Like I had no idea what was going on
with the way that scene goes, because he kind of drifts off in the middle of who is it? Which official is it he's talking to? The one he finds in bed. It's not Erlanger. It's
it's like Burger or something with a B.
Let me see if I can find this.
Burgle.
Oh yeah, Burgle.
Yeah,
so
Burgle.
He stumbles into the wrong room and finds an official in bed, but by accidentally getting in front of one, he now actually has an audience with someone. But so then he just gets this. it's almost like a rant given for effect, like the effect being, it's like a filibuster. Like he's just trying to wear him out and make him give up by just sort of explaining why nothing's ever going to happen in this case. But it's just, that's a shame, but it's the way things are. And really, it's nobody's fault. If anyone's fault, it's yours. You just kind of need to not worry about it. And in the middle of this, Kay drifts off to sleep and has this dream. And I almost see it as like a Pride Before the Fall thing, because I think, he's finally has access to some official in Burgle by accident. And he drifts off to sleep. And I sort of see the dream where he's fighting an official in the form of a Greek god, a naked official in the form of a Greek god. It's sort of like the Greek god aspect is someone who's so powerful, above, invincible, and it's like, oh, now I have you. You're naked. The guy's he's not just naked in the way that like Greek gods are portrayed. He's like trying to cover himself. He's ashamed, and so and
he's like squealing too.
Yeah, and Kay is winning the fight, we should say. And I kind of see it as in his little dream, he feels like, yes, I've finally got it. I've got him on the back foot. I can roll with my momentum here. And then when he does wake up, Burgle's speech kind of has the intended effect of it. It just wears him out, and he's kind of given up and just goes and sits in the hallway. And that's kind of how I interpreted the dream. It's a dream in terms of like it's aspirational. Like he feels like, I finally have this victory over these people who are gods in this situation, the officials who can't be touched, and now I have them cornered. But ultimately, he's wrong. He's mistaken.
I think there's also like kind of this element there where there's kind of this masculine desire to be able to fall back on violence, like you're faced with like, again, this like overwhelming bureaucracy and like this faceless system, like you can't find any like egress into. And so I think that there is like this very like, it's a little natural, but also like very masculine, like understood urge to like, what if we could just go back? Like, what if I could just go back in time to like a point where I could just punch someone in the face and that would solve my problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that there's essentially no actual physical violence in the book. He gets hit on the hand by the assistant teacher, which I think is interesting because she's an overseer and she's a lot more overzealous than any of the officials who are really just very passive and can use just the regulations as weapons.
Yeah, the teacher is almost like sadistic.
Like and
I wouldn't,
like the
maybe that's too far, but like
as well are also more gung ho because they have that bit of proximity to power, and they really fight to keep that separation above the rest of the common people. But yeah, I think there is an interesting axis there, and it's sort of a modern thing in that there is a in the terms that they would use then, if physical violence is masculine, then the modern era is emasculated because everything is regulation, it's procedure, it's process, rather than like if you just go in and hit an official, it's not going to help. Like you are in error if you do that, if you're not being a hero.
Yeah, and as you said, it should be noted that like one of his few unqualified triumphs, besides having sex with Frida, which we could also talk about, is having that dream where he just like bum rushes one of the secretaries.
Do we want to talk about Frida? I feel like
I think
she's a character we've danced around a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there in terms of Kay as a character, and I think probably kind of getting to like Kafka's like views on like women in relationships.
Yeah, and I finished the book earlier today, and I guess it was technically after the end of the original manuscript, as it was marked in my book, but I think that was probably in your editions as well, where Pepe is giving the long explanation of like, here's what you don't know about Frida. Okay.
Yeah.
So you get that very late, like literally at the end of the book, inversion of like, actually, she was playing you all along, and I kind of get the impression that that's just Pepe's interpretation, right? But also we can't really know. But yeah, I would say when Kay first encounters Frida, it's when we start really seeing that, like in the few scenes leading up to that, and then unequivocally when he's interacting with her, like Kay's not a good guy. He's just as manipulative as everyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Frida, crucially, like at the beginning of the book, she is Clom's mistress.
Yeah, and barmaid at the inn.
Yeah,
that the gentleman.
She's a barmaid, and basically Kay is able to seduce her, and they end up becoming engaged because they have sex.
Right. Yeah, about a day. So.
And I feel like she like I feel like we've mentioned her before. I don't want to say she's like the moral center of the book, but she is like the only person who seems to, like somebody said earlier, like seems to see any alternative to like the way things are. She's like, we could go somewhere else. There's kind of a heartbreaking scene where towards the end of the book, she breaks off their engagement more or less.
Well, several times.
And several times, but like it's the last time it happens in the version of the book we have. I guess it could have happened several more times if the book had been completed. We can't say, but she's like, we could have left and like we could have been together and like your hand always could have been close enough for me to hold it or something like that. And it was like a very like kind of touching, like strikingly like touching line for a book like this. And I feel like, I don't really know what quite to make of that in her, like her as a character. I feel like there's kind of this idealization on one level, but then there's kind of a weird like Madonna whore complex going on almost, where she's like one of the only characters who feels like they might be a good person deep down, but also she's been like this official's mistress. She sleeps with Clom, like not Clom, Kay, like kind of at the drop of a hat, and then kind of like I definitely felt like there was this element where like we're supposed to feel like he's kind of trapped in this relationship, like he's kind of it's been foisted upon him.
Like he thought he was making a maneuver, but he actually ended up.
Well, the scene where that happens the most to me is he sleeps with Frida, and then Clom actually calls to her, and they're like in the bar, and they presumably like they slept like in the beer puddles, which I think is an incredible
under
detail.
The counter of the bar,
but she goes, "I'm with the land surveyor," and in announcing that, Kay's like, "What are you doing?" like I think he thought he was going to secretly have sex with her and then like find out more about the castle, but she basically like announces the fact to Clom, and like that's when I think like the entrapment, we could say, starts, because then suddenly he's lost his advantage or whatever, like, in this kind of whatever.
Also the point where he's forced to take the job as the school janitor. And because she's like, you need to get a job, like we have to set up a house, like we don't have any money, how are we supposed to set up a household?
I just wanted to mention in the context of when he first meets Frida, she is one of these characters who she is from the town, but has that proximity to power. She works. There are two inns in the town. There's the Bridge Inn, which is near the bridge into town. It's where Kay first arrives, and it's the lower place. It's for just the peasants. It's not so nice.
For travelers, people just coming into town, like passing through.
And then there's the Herrenhof Inn, which just essentially means like the gentleman's inn. And that's in like...
Yeah, it's translated in my edition as the gentleman's inn.
Okay. Yeah, I know we had some different translations on a lot of stuff. So those may come up. But the Herrenhof Inn is in like the upper town. It's proximal to the castle. It's where when the officials from the castle come into town, they stay there. And so Frida works there, and that's how she's had contact with Clom. And so she's one of these characters like the assistant teacher or any of the servants of the castle who they don't actually have like standing. It could all be gone in an instant, but they have proximity to the power of the castle, and they really lord it over people. And we see that with Peppy as well. When she gets moved up to fill Frida's job in the Herrenhof, she becomes like very haughty and full of herself. And as soon as she leaves the job, she's back to being a dejected, oppressed person. So when Kay first meets Frida, she's like, "Oh, a very appealing piece because it's like, in one way, it's a young girl. I can probably get in here, but she is adjacent to something that I need.
Like, she can tell me how to get, like, meet with this Clom guy, and he can clear this all up, and I can get my cushy land surveying gig and, like, cool my heels.
And too, and this, like, when they end up at, like, there's a scene where they finally end up at the schoolhouse and they're talking, and Kay starts, like, manipulating a little boy to maybe get closer to the castle. And Frida sees this happen and sort of, if she hadn't realized it, she suddenly realizes that Kay is, like, not a nice person. And that scene is also, like, kind of crushing to me because, like,
she's explaining it to
me
him.
at least, she totally reads him completely when she sees him, like, manipulate this kid.
Because the landlady of the bridge inn where they stay briefly before getting the okay to live and work in the school. They're staying at, like, the maids get kicked out of their room, and that becomes the bridal suite for Kay and Frida in just, like, a back room. And the landlady is, you know, from Kay's perspective, meddling, and from her perspective, trying to, you know, save Frida because she's known her since she's a little girl, and she has a very bad feeling about Kay. And the scene where she's telling Kay, like, I didn't believe her at first at all. I thought she was just trying to pull us apart. And then the way you acted, you know, broke my heart, made me realize she was right. And, like, I can't trust you. You we're trying to, like, comfort a kid, but really just trying to get, like, information about, like, oh, so your parents, like, they kind of got a little farther, a little closer to the castle. What are their names? Like, what do they do? Where do they live? Well, and also the kid says, you know, I want to be a man like you, because Kay is, like, literally the only person who's ever questioned anything in this town. And that also just breaks Frida's heart because she's already realized, like, Kay's this bad guy. And then the kid is like, I want to be like you. And it's like, you want to be like this desperate, manipulative guy. So, Frida is, it's hard to say if she's a tragic character because ultimately she's able to exist within this society, but
we also, again, there's no ending. We don't know what her, like, actual, like, conclusion of her story would have been, which is kind of crucial for tragedy.
Well, and when she breaks off with Kay, she ends up back at the bar, and she's with one of the
servants,
assistants. Who's, like, very ill. like there's, like, a scene where he's, like, wrapped in a blanket and he's like, ugh.
And doesn't he, like, he looks really old, and, like, Kay had never noticed before because the other assistant, Arthur, is very young, and, like, they just, like, had evened each other out to the point where you couldn't tell what they looked like.
Yeah, that was a moment where I was like, did time pass? Like I was like it seemed like all of a sudden, like, he's been doing this for years and his assistants are old. But like you said, John, I think it's because, like, they wanted them to be the same, so he pretended they were both, like, younger. Like, Arthur.
I only want one assistant, so I'm just going to kind of think of you as one guy.
Yeah, I love also where the assistants are always, like, cheering at the wrong times. Like they're just like, yeah, and he's just like, shut up. Like
I love that, again, when the assistants want to file a complaint about him, just one of them can just go up to the castle and file a complaint. And he's been, again, like, he's been begging this whole book, like, can someone please go, like, file something with the castle for me so I can get this figured out. And his assistants are like, we could do that, but we'd rather do this.
It's not only that Arthur can just go up the castle whenever he wants. It's like Jeremiah, I believe he says, like, he's probably getting all kinds of, like, medals and commendations while he's up there. Like, you've made a powerful enemy, essentially. And it's just this guy who's just
you slighted one of your
stooge who's just been bumbling around. And it turns out actually, like, these were essentially feds who were just following you around.
If you just laughed at their jokes, this all could have been over.
They were sent.
There's a powerful lesson in that
to cheer him up and make him, like, stop worrying and take everything so seriously. Like, this guy is just beating his head against the wall. Try and cheer him up a little bit. So, yeah, they're just
Well, I wonder
around.
too if that's like a reflection on like I wouldn't quite say dehumanization, but just like how he had to have the dream that he assaulted a secretary, he gets to like abuse these assistants when he feels powerless. Like, so like I wonder if that's like kind of like a like, we think they're funny because we're clearly on the side of the guys that do bits, but like, you know, from Kay's perspective, he's like, I have to take my, you know, like my anger out on something.
Well, and it's the only people that who have a lower position than him, or so he thinks. So yeah, I mean, even people who are oppressed or have just come up one step on the ladder instantly treat the people below them like shit. Like, just like, now I am one step above you, and I've always wanted to be here, and I'm going to treat you like they've always treated me. So yeah, like, Kay is obviously like, I mean, it's literally said he's a non-entity in this town. They don't have a place for him. He does not fit into the framework. He's a non-person. His work is in question, whether or not his job ever existed or he has a reason to be there. But there are at least these two guys that he can boss around. Like, hits them, kicks them out of the house.
Yeah, doesn't he like tie one of them to like a railing, and the guy's like stuck?
He ties
like
him,
his coattails. Like,
he ties himself to the railing because it's after Kay has been yelled at by the teacher, and he blames everything on the assistants and kicks them out to make a show of like, don't worry, I'm taking care of this. And then they're just begging to be let back in. They're at the fence and leaning on the railing all day out in the cold, which is where Jeremiah gets sick. But he's there so long that like his legs start to wear out. And he like ties himself to the fence with his sash so he can still stay up. And they're literally just like begging, like bowing their heads, shaking their hands. Please.
Yeah, and he like shuts the window. He's like, yeah.
Well, there's also the bit towards the end where he's like, he has to go out and like meet one of them. It's like when he goes out and meet Jeremiah, and he asks somebody like, "Do you have a whip?"
Yeah, he goes out to beat him because they were spying on him.
Yeah,
talking to Olga, and he goes out to beat him, and he's like, "You didn't have to sneak out the back. I know the back way is there. You could have just come out the front. Like, you didn't have to sneak around." Yeah, so the assistants are kind of a question throughout because Kay shows up to town alone, and he says that his assistants are, you know, coming later from presumably wherever he came from. But then these two are sent down and show up at the inn while he's first arrived in town and say, "We're your assistants." And they've been sent from the castle. And so, you know, he's given these two guys to just be his assistants, but they aren't, and he's never met them before.
Crucially, they know nothing about land surveying. They're very upfront that they know nothing about land surveying. They have no experience with it.
Yeah, there's a sentence like in the beginning where it's like they do random tasks for him, and even fetch him a little bit of rum should he want some. like there's like a like just telling your two assistants to get you some alcohol because your job hasn't showed up yet. Your official designation.
What? So are there any other characters that really stood out to you guys as interesting?
I mean, yeah, I would say, but
it's a surprisingly big cast. Like I didn't quite know what to expect going into it, but there's a lot of characters and like they're all named.
I would say the landlady, we can just say she is. I think in her way she's compassionate. She really harangues Kay for like why do you persist? Like, you're making it harder on yourself. What you're trying to do is impossible, and only a fool like you couldn't see it. And yeah, so she's annoying to him because he thinks like, nah, I'm gonna do it. I'm smarter than these people. I can maneuver my way up. And she's, partially out of just like, she refers to him like a child doing something foolish. It might hurt itself. Like, I'm trying to keep you from hurting yourself. And then when he gets Frida involved, and she's known Frida since she was a little girl, she's like, now you've got someone I care about wrapped up in this. And she doubles down on her just multi-page protests and like pleas for just stop, give up. And so she's one form of resistance, I guess you could say, in that it's like, compassionate in that it's like, look, you might not like it, but it's harder the way that you're going. I think.
I also think too, like she's almost sort of like the in-laws for Frida to check to see if Kay is a good husband.
Yeah.
So like, there's these things that you've been saying, but there's also this kind of like, I don't know, whatever the like sexual social dynamics of the time where you have to like clear everything with the relatives of the person you're seeing, like that's sort of like I think in addition to what you were saying too.
Yeah, and then I think Barnabas, his whole family is definitely important to talk about, if only because I mean they get a lot of time, and I'm a little confused.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time with them
about certain aspects of it. And Olga makes sense, obviously, because she can tell a very parallel story to Kay's and sort of say, like, look, we've gone through what you're trying to do. They had this scandal involving their family where a sister rebuked an official's approach and their family was just kind of silently shunned, but there was never anything official. So it's like, well, if there's never anything official done against you, there's nothing to undo because there's no decree
Nothing
against
happened.
you. Just what's happening now just is chance. People just aren't talking to you anymore. People won't do business with you anymore.
Yeah, Kundera calls that like one of the chief Kafka-esque elements, which is that the fault seeks the punishment.
Yeah, exactly. You're dying to even know what your crime is, because before you can even try and get forgiveness, you have to know like what you did, which is the central thing in the trial as well, where Kay never knows what he's accused of, and they're just like, you'll find out at your trial, basically. Like, so Olga is one of the two sisters of Barnabas, who is a messenger for the castle. He brings a message down to Kay when he first arrives in town. And
Barnabas was actually a character that I liked a lot.
Well, and Kay really likes him, and it kind of we get some explanation of it, but I was still kind of confused as to why Kay. I guess it makes sense, but I felt like they're given the attention. There must be something more than just Kay sees him as a hope because he's a guy that can get into the castle. But Kay really is just like, this is my little angel boy. And there was one sentence where
he's wearing a cool white tunic.
There was one sentence where I highlighted it, and I think it was done for effect, but he says Barnabas like 5 times. It's like, I have to go see Barnabas. And when I talk to Barnabas, he's going to help me, and Barnabas will help me get into the castle, and his sister, and you just like, he's just so obsessed with this idea of Barnabas. And I felt like there had to be something more than just like, he's maybe my stepping stone. He just seemed to be like this little radiant angel figure almost, but he's just kind of got this naive nobility to him, I suppose.
So I have a thought on that, actually. What I noticed with Barnabas a lot is that he is like, they're constantly drawing attention to like how like quick and agile he is, and like he's always like kind of weaving in and out between people. And I kind of think that part of the reason Kay likes him is because like that's how Kay like thinks of himself. Like Kay thinks he's this like smooth operator who's like ducking and weaving and like, going between people and making connections. And then Barnabas kind of is that. Now, how much of that is like through his own powers versus like, again, he has this proximity to power, like being employed by the castle. But I think that like Kay like kind of wants to like, he's like, oh, when I get in with the castle, like I'm going to be like Barnabas. Like I'm going to be like a guy who's like.
But then like during Olga's backstory, it's revealed he has like a lot of personal doubt.
Yeah.
And that like when he goes to the castle, he's not really clear if he talks to anyone. Like there's some like, it's like the uncertainty of what he actually
he's
does.
Like in awe and terror when he's up there. But I think especially like Kay has this opinion seeing Barnabas, not knowing the dynamics of the town, and he comes to realize like Barnabas and his family are loathed in the town. Anytime he talks to Frida about like, I need to go talk to Barnabas, find a little bit more, she's like, I cannot believe you're going to see them. Like, you keep talking about them. Yeah. Things are already bad between us. Like, and you keep going to see these people. And, we come to learn it's because of this scandal with Amalia, and the family has been scorned. But, Barnabas, through a fluke, essentially gets a chance to work as a messenger for the castle. And this might be a good place to bring up something that I think is kind of a very important axis through or scale throughout the entire book, which is we have the level between official and unofficial, which is semi-official. And a lot of stuff is done semi-officially, where it's like, well, we'll let you meet with an official, but if you're meeting with them at night, it's only semi-official. And if you do actually manage to get anything done, they're really not held to it because it's only semi-official, but there's still a lot of rules and protocols for it. It's not just like meeting someone and talking to them in the street. It is still governed by all these rules, but it's semi-official. So it actually has no real grounding. It has no importance.
Yeah, sort of like the one-way street of power, where it's like you have to constantly be debasing yourself, but like all the leeway's on the other end. It's like they don't have to do anything if it's semi-official, but you still have to behave in an XYZ way.
And the mayor says that about the second letter I think Crom sends, where it's like a personal letter, which means it's not exactly official, but there's still some semi-officialness involved. Like, and they argue about that letter.
Semi-official is worse than a personal letter, because if it were official, like, hey, no problem, like everything is done according to the letter. If it's a personal letter, that's maybe even better, because it's like he is reaching out directly to you as a man. But if it's semi-official, it's just kind of like, this could just sort of be effectively a draft or an offhand note. It's so unclear as to be useless or worse. And that semi-official level is sort of that, is the level where you're appeased in that something is happening, but it's, it's empty calories. You get something to eat, but it is empty. It is, you can't get anything out of it.
Yeah, and I think that too seems particularly like we might say modern or postmodern, like the idea that there's like a register in between the official and the unofficial that can sort of just like float around as necessary and like doesn't get affixed to anything concrete. I wouldn't say it's like post-truth or something, but I think like that idea of like there being like a third thing that it's like
neither A nor B.
Well, it's not official.
Neither A nor B, and because we really can only think in terms of A or B, it's nothing. Also, regarding the scandal with Barnabas' family and Amalia, so we have, is it Sortini or Sordini? The two officials.
There's both. There's two.
It's one of the two.
Who actually, essentially, Amalia catches the eye of an official, and he's furious. He's like, I cannot believe that this just, common woman from the town is attracting me, and he is just so up in arms. He writes her like just a fucked up letter where it's implied he's making like sexual advances, but also just like hating her for like, you're not good enough to make me want you, but like come to my hotel room. And she refuses, and this is the scandal that leads to the family being ostracized. But in that official being so furious, it's that divide of like, he is from the castle, and him having any response to anything that happens in the town or the people of the town is like him being debased. He should not be affected by these people at all. And the fact that one of them attracted him is like a sin to him, and it makes him furious. And then he also feels that he can just demand that she come and satisfy him.
Yeah, that is something really interesting with the castle itself. Like, there's this intimation that like the people who live in the like they live in the castle. It's not like an office. Like, it's not like a place that they like work at and then like they go home at night. Like, they all live there. They're all men. And so like there's no mention of like they have wives. Like, they all just seem to like basically live together as like kind of this weird
they do all seem to be
like
bachelors.
monastic brotherhood of bureaucrats who just again are like their whole life seems to be just devoted to basically maintaining like the bureaucracy.
They're all very sensitive too. They cannot be exposed to the dirt and like harassment of the lower world, kind of in the way that, royals were always treated. They have to be kept apart.
Yeah.
And like from Kay's perspective, he sort of feels the same way about people in the town, except when he hears their stories, like with Olga and Amelia's story. Like that's when they suddenly get humanized.
Yeah.
Well, like Ben, you were saying earlier, kind of with the semi-official stuff, I think that's like a really big key to this book. Like again, it's called The Castle. So like I kept thinking back to like kind of more medieval modes of storytelling as I was reading this. And I think that like one of the core like kind of discomfort in this book is like kind of the idea that like social relations in modernity are like no longer like cut and dry. Yeah. It's like Kay feels like he should be able to get access to the castle in a way that like if he were a medieval like serf like protagonist, he would not feel like that. Like the social divide would be much more firm. And while like that's not good, like obviously like a lot of like horror and like bad things can be mined from like those kinds of social relations, like the frustration of like feeling like you should be able to like deal with people as equals, but then power still actually being there is kind of this core experience of modernity.
Having a very modern, complex bureaucracy overlaid on a literal, castle town. And so you have people who are peasants. And honestly, if you removed, say, the mention of the telephone at the beginning, the fire engine in the scene with Sordini, and I suppose just the fact of there being a school, this could be from any range of like 500 years, where it's just anywhere from medieval to slightly pre-modern town. But yes, we do have a telephone. The
bureaucracy is like the most modern thing, like the fact that it's not literally like a duke like in the castle,
right?
Except there is a count,
West.
The local graph, West. Yeah. But again, he's like mentioned like a couple times at the very beginning, and he's not a like major presence.
Which I think it implies it's just like, even for Kay, that's too high to aim. I can probably talk to Klom though.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's a very the castle is really a town unto itself. I kind of I don't think, Ben, you've read it, but I know John has read at least the first book of the Gormenghast series, where just labyrinthine castle that's been added onto itself endlessly. Everybody's got their own little corners, and in some of these corners they might not actually see anyone else for like months on end, because what they do is so niche that it might just be forgotten about at times, but they are still an employee of the castle, even if their job is to just dust the wood carvings in this one room at the far end of the castle.
Well, like it almost reminds me a bit of like the monastery from Name of the Rose, where like it's just kind of this hermetically sealed, not hermetically sealed, but it's like kind of this sealed off place where it's like we kind of like, again, we never see inside the castle, but we have to like you assume that it's this like incredibly strange place where people are doing things for arcane reasons, like you kind of like they kind of don't even know the full scope of what they do.
I would say,
and so there's this whole other world, like this higher world almost that we never get access to, but there's all these kind of subtle intimations of what's in there, and it seems like it's probably cooler than what's going on in the town.
We have to assume, because everyone aspires to it. The only glimpse we really get to anything happening in there is in Olga's story, when she talks about what Barnabas tells her when he comes back. And Barnabas is, he's a pretty, feckless. He's naive, right? He's sensitive. And so when he's in the castle, he's just kind of terrified. None of it makes sense. It's not clear. The way it works, he's a messenger, and he might not get a message for months on end. And then they'll give him one that's like old and wrinkled and dusty and clearly has been sitting around for a while, and go tell him to deliver it. At which point it's probably irrelevant. And actually, no, I think it is implied. Wasn't Kay's message the first he was told to deliver?
I don't recall.
Okay.
Oh man, maybe.
But so when we do get a glimpse inside, it's kind of like a like if a human gets a glimpse of a higher plane or a heaven where everything's a bit too bright, everything is so it's bureaucratic, and actually it's just, we do get that impression of in the petition room, the officials sit behind a desk that's so close to the wall that they have to like inch behind each other. So it is kind of uncanny, but just everybody there knows their place, and he's told to be there for his job, and he's just kind of terrified the whole time. And I do love when he passes the note to so Kay's given him a note to just give to someone up in the castle, ideally Clom, and Barnabas is just kind of struck dumb. But then before he leaves, he's finally able to just hand it to some random secretary in the hallway, and the guy just throws it on the ground. But yeah, Barnabas and he doesn't even say anything. He just like holds out the letter, and he's literally struck dumb by like being in the presence of, essentially gods. And we see that in the Greek god Dream. But yeah, I think that is the only description we get of the actual workings in the castle.
Kundera has an interesting point about the fact that the bureaucracy. Well, I think Kundera and Mark Fisher say this, but basically, because he says it in Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher does, that the bureaucracy was not built for humans, and so its ultimate purpose is like alien. And so it might come across as like higher world, as religious. But also, Mark Fisher says that like the main structure, according to him, is disavowal, where you go, well, I don't know what's going on. I can't tell you. I can't help you. Basically the fact that nobody because again, if somebody could help him, it would be great. But nobody seems to know because the purpose is alien. So you can only just disavow. And so like that to me is that's what Fisher says. But I think that's one explanation for why it seems so weird and kind of alien and legendary.
I know we talked a little bit earlier and we weren't sure if we were going to do this. Do we want to talk about this book as like religious allegory? Because it is an angle a lot of people come at, and I feel like I have some things to say about it.
Yes.
Yeah,
talk about it.
I think we should do that because I think
my feeling is there is religious allegory in it. I don't read the whole book as a religious allegory. I see it as a thread that's woven in throughout pretty compellingly once you're alerted to it through naming and things like that. But I don't feel like that's the point. Like I think just like in the same way Kundera's analysis of is this a socialist novel or an anti-capitalist novel? And it's like, well, there's maybe a thread of that, but it's not. It's a commentary on that, but that's not the point of the book. Yeah. Like
Kafka's not self-consciously ideological, and he's not like self-consciously religious. I agree with that. But for me, like as I was reading it, and again, kind of coming across stuff like you were saying, Ben, and some of that critique from Fisher, for me, it really comes down to like the fact of Kafka's Jewishness. Like, I think that the idea that this is it's not so much that this is a religious novel so much as this is like written by a Jewish person who's like familiar with like Jewish idioms for like discussing like God and the divine. Yeah. And so like, have either of you ever read anything by Maimonides, like Guide for the Perplexed or anything like that?
Yes, sir.
No.
So I've read that. It's a 12th, for those who aren't aware, it's a 12th century rabbinical Judaic text written by Maimonides, who was a rabbi, and it's really kind of an explication of how you can say anything about God, and like how you it's basically a defense of like Jewish theology in the context of like a 12th century like rabbi living in like the Muslim world. But it went on to be very, very influential. It's definitely like kind of a foundational text for like a lot of like Jewish, particularly like mystical understanding of God. And he has this great bit about how like God cannot be seen or understood like by the human mind. So there are like two ways you can see God, and that's you can see like God through metaphor in scripture. And he like specifically has this idea of like you can like basically look at like a treasure through like a screen, and like you can't see the whole thing, but you can see like bits of it. Or if you're like a prophet, you can like basically be a blind man who then like for a moment, you see,
Yeah.
there's like a lightning flash, and you see like the world for like an instant, and it like drives you mad.
Yeah, like looking at an
And
eclipse, like you can look at the edge safely.
Yeah. And so with like Fisher, I feel like there's something there, but I feel like he's kind of missing something in his critique by, I think, probably just kind of not knowing the full context of like, I think Kafka's Judaism. Because for me, what it is like the castle is incomprehensible because it is like divine in a way, and to be divine is to be incomprehensible.
The same sort of Jewish relationship to God that we might see in like A Serious Man, where it's just like, who knows? That could mean a lot, or it could mean nothing. The goy's tooth.
Yeah. Like obviously, none of us are Jewish, but someone who's like read a fair amount of like Jewish writing, I feel like we can draw parallels.
Yeah, and too, like, Fisher's just kind of conscripting Kafka to talk about how capitalism gets normalized. So that's kind of like his kind of critical project, and not maybe one that's geared towards talking about like.
I think maybe the processes that
Fisher,
Kafka refers to, it's like applicable to capitalism, but I think it is an overreach to say that's what Kafka is doing.
Yeah, like again, I don't like. I think it's something where again he's not like self-consciously being ideological or religious, but he's also like he's someone who's like drawing so much out of himself to write that there's going to be stuff that reads that way because like we all have like religious thoughts, ideological like thoughts that are part of us, even if we're not like self-consciously doing it. Does that make sense?
And I've thought about that a lot because, I grew up going to church, but it was kind of a passive thing. And by the time I was, before puberty even, hadn't been going to church, was never confirmed. And so I was raised with it. And, I haven't really lived my life according to Christianity since then. But all of that stuff is implanted in my brain. And, just trying to imagine like being totally blank of not knowing, all the parables, which are just kind of bedrock references at this point. And, and not knowing all the dynamics just because, all of our canonical stuff is essentially a few degrees removed from something from the Bible. And, so it is interesting to imagine, being a total blank slate, which I guess is, Kay coming into a system like that and being totally unaware of any of the system, not knowing, in this sense, the parables, the rabbinical law, whatever, like, why can't I eat shellfish? Why can't I eat meat and cheese together? Like, that's just the way it is.
And struggling against it just makes it worse.
The Serious Man connection, but I mean, obviously the Coens, we could say, a lot of Kafka influences on any of their movies, just
Oh, absolutely.
Especially like in A Serious Man when he talks to the succession of rabbis, because like the first one is like, wow, you could just be out in the parking lot having a great time. like he doesn't he's like, I don't want that, I want the answer. And then the Goy's Tooth one where the answer is inscrutable to him, but it was clearly like cool to the guy that heard it the first time. And then the third rabbi just has nothing. Like he's just listening to, what is it? Jefferson Airplane.
There's also, I don't know, my favorite bit in that movie, aside from the Goy's Tooth, is the last rabbi who's talking to his son, who's high out of his mind.
Bar mitzvah, right?
And and I feel like the implication there is that rabbi was giving like real wisdom, and the son's just like,
well, and being
just like none of it's
high
scanning.
Also for that interaction, that like the what would you call it? What's the word for it? The like the state that like the oracles would get into, like the
a trance.
There's a better word for it, but like the trance-like state in which you are receptive to the divine, whether it's standing over a sulfur vent and like half suffocating, or just being really high at your bar mitzvah.
Yeah, like when they move the stick down the Torah, it makes that huge scraping noise.
It's just good stuff. Let's see. We've kind of left this behind. Do you feel there are any other characters we should address, like with a fine point?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've hit kind of all the big characters,
or at least the ones that recur. Most others are just kind of passed by. So
yeah, you know, like there's not. I don't think there's a lot to talk about, like the Hans, the landlord, or like
or Gerstecker.
Epi or
there's some interesting stuff
Lazaman.
in the names, and if you look at the show notes, like we found a pretty nice article about Q names in this, and there's a lot to look into and interesting things, but I don't think it's necessary to go into many of those characters just because they maybe reflect a certain thing that Kay is supposed to learn, but I don't think they really have as much bearing as the people we've already talked about.
Yeah, and sometimes their function is just for like a specific scene, like with the dream guy, Burger or Bruegel. Yeah.
Again, I feel like it comes down to like the kind of weird way this text feels very unfinished. Like these characters, some of these characters may be characters who's like maybe their scenes would have been cut, maybe they would have been rolled into a different character, maybe they would have had an expanded role had this book kind of been able to be
we do see a lot more of
see
a lot more of Erlanger at the end, and in some of the stuff that was removed in the appendix, there's more Erlanger, so you kind of get the impression that maybe, I guess that there's sort of it almost seems like Erlanger is trying to like piggyback on Kay getting close to the like oh, this guy's actually having some success, and I'll kind of wait for him to get the door open and I'll slip through at the same time. But that never actually plays out. So, nature of the book being unfinished, I suppose. A lot of speculation. And honestly, it is maybe a bit like pat to say this, but like it's a book that lends itself very well to being unfinished because it's kind of the ultimate ending for this, in that there is nothing to wrap it. It is open on one end. You can't really say where it starts or finishes or what the possible end could be.
Yeah. No, like it's one of those things where I think you said that like Kafka told somebody how
just kind of a verbal, semi-official, just like kind of here's what I'm thinking of, and
we still don't know. Like again, presumably other stuff would have happened in between that. Would he have eventually gotten into the castle? Would the castle, in a complete version of this text, have remained this kind of structuring absence, or would there have been a bit where he goes into the castle, and would that disenchant it and make it, would that ruin the book in some way?
Okay, John, he gets to the castle and they're playing sentimental Irish songs by a mysterious god known as Bono. And he just has to stand there and listen to those, and nobody knows where his file is.
Admitted to the Central Visitor Services Department, and Bono, of course, would be a great Kafka name.
But there's something,
Bon, good man, ironically.
Good man-o.
But I feel like there's something interesting with this book where, like, again, had Kafka lived, like, this could have just ended up in a garbage can and just been like, again, like when you write stuff, I don't have anything probably this long or this good, but you end up with a lot of stuff that just kind of never comes to fruition. It just goes in a drawer. Or
it almost works perfectly for the system because it's all just meant to be red herrings, and like it really. I mean, I'm an anxious person, and it really emulates the anxious state really well because I have all this information. It could all be vital to me, but if I worry about it, that takes energy. What pieces are worth holding on to? Like what's important, what's vital, and you ultimately just kind of drive yourself crazy. So
yeah, like this is almost like more than a book. Like it's like an artifact in some ways. Like it's this kind of summation of like what people think of when they think of like Kafka-esque, and it's like, there's nothing at the bottom.
I
there's
found
no answer.
myself thinking of that over the course of reading this. Like this almost feels like the most archetypical Kafka novel in that, like, I think it does the grandest analysis of like the themes that he was generally getting at, which kind of makes sense for it being his later last work.
His most mature work, you'd say.
But then you could say, well, the trial hits this stuff in a shorter length and is complete, and maybe that's kind of like the emblematic work. But then it's like, well, but everybody reads the Metamorphosis, and then we kind of talked like, really, it's maybe best summed up in just like the page and a half of before the law, because it's essentially the castle is that repeated ad nauseum, just or ad infinitum, really.
And in Before the Law, it's a guy who's trying to get through a door, and the guy's like, I can't let you in. And then, somebody walks in and he's like, what about that guy? And he's like, now's not the time. And then he's like there basically until he dies. And the guy goes, well, now the door is only open for you.
It's crucial,
it's like your only way
the guy
through.
It's like his last breaths. And the guard is like looking down at him. He's no longer able to even sit up. He's on the ground, like collapsing, dying of old age. He spent his whole life there. And the guard bends down to him, not maliciously, but it's crushing, because what he says is, this door was only ever made for you, but now I'm closing it. Like, you never attained your destiny. You didn't do it right. And so I think that's throughout the whole thing is, that you have to find your crime. The theme of guilt is throughout here, and guilt as a weapon to discourage you from trying. Like, well, you can beat people, or you can make them feel that they're bad. I mean, that's what the CIA torture manuals tell. Yeah. What's effective is to do something horrible to someone and then make them think it's their fault. That's the secret ingredient to torture. You can beat people, but then if they're just like, well, these horrible people, there's a chance of resistance. But if you convince them, I don't want to do this to you. Why do you keep making me do this to you? Why do you persist? That's what breaks you. Guilt throughout, obviously, but and obviously huge religious cross-contamination there with guilt, especially, stereotypically Jewish guilt of like essentially the idea of that being self-inflicted. Like,
yeah. Well, and I also like, I think the religious element is important, and I think also I wanted to mention that like his friend Max Brod like published the castle, even though Kafka said burn it, get rid of it. And if you believe some accounts like Kundera's, Max Brod kind of remade Kafka into like this secular saint. And I think that is an interesting like note to kind of bring the religious elements like solely to the fore, as opposed to kind of like letting them exist within all the other stuff. And I'm sort of sympathetic to Kundera's point there, where he's like, yeah, we should preserve the autonomy of this rather than kind of collapsing it into like, oh, it's purely religion, it's purely capitalism, it's purely one thing. I think the fun stuff is having.
I think it is a disservice to how good Kafka was as an author to kind of treat him as like this sage or saint, or kind of tuned into some wavelength at the beginning of the 20th century where he could see it all coming. And actually, on the back of my edition of this book, there's a little painting of Kafka, and it's somewhere between like a Clive Barker painting and a like Francis Bacon painting, very smeary, shadowy, and it kind of gives him this air of like him being represented in what people think of him as, these dark, mysterious, shadowy worlds. And in reality, he's having parties with his friends, reading his book aloud, and they're all laughing like crazy. And he loves the ladies. Like he's
writing a letter to his boss about how he can't come into work because he has a tummy ache.
and so I think to cast him as like, this man who lived in and could see the tendrils of the modern world crawling in the corners, I think that is fanciful. I agree.
And again, I think it does him a disservice because, like, again, I feel like that's a big part of why I didn't read him for the longest time because I was like,
if you read it,
"Ugh."
if you read
Like,
it for
I
a
don't wanna-
depressing book, like you can get that reading, but you really miss like how sharp a lot of what he's writing is and how emotionally affecting it is. Like the ups and downs of emotional states with hope and fear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I wanted to add too, like at some point the castle becomes like a social relations novel.
Mhm.
Like it becomes like a Jane Austen or like a people talking. It
Yeah.
just so happens
yeah.
to be that they're trying to get to the castle, but like the people come really to the fore. You know, it's not like the idea of bureaucracy, like although that's there, but
Well, again, like that's what I was kind of saying earlier. It's like I was so shocked by like how many characters there were in this novel, like how like dense like the social element of it is. Because again,
Yeah.
I was used to thinking of Kafka as like this guy who's like writing like these very like high allegories where it's like it is K and the state.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh wait, no, he's basically doing like Jane Austen or like Middlemarch stuff. Like with this small
I do
village.
find that a lot of characters do feel like very aphoristic, and I kind of learned to be primed for that. Like, okay, like clearly this person is supposed to teach Kay something in how they relate to the castle or this society, and you know what is the lesson this person is supposed to teach.
Yeah,
right.
Like that element's there, but it's not as like overwhelming as I think kind of the image of Kafka you get in like a lot of like undergrad
and I think especially in the
he's-
castle here, it really is a testament to how well he was writing at this point that it isn't one or the other. It's a really good marriage of an actual novel with strongly aphoristic like shades over it.
Yeah. I did think it's interesting. I don't know about you guys. I felt like the social element came to the fore a lot more when I noticed this turn when we find out the landlord of the inn's name and kind of his background. And like that definitely to me felt like the point where like there's this turn and all of a sudden like we're dealing with these people on like a human level
people like
a lot more.
Well, that's kind of like if you look at the inverse relationship to power, like if you know their name, you're getting too close. And up to this point, everyone is just their role. It's the innkeeper, the innkeeper's wife, the barmaid,
the assistants.
Yeah. And once they have names, there's instantly incredible depth, but also vulnerability. Like because often it's a two-way negotiation and manipulation and maneuvering because like there's just pitfalls all around. If Kay says the wrong thing, does this person have connections that could be really bad for me or useful for me? It's
well, that's kind of again why the denizens of the castle have to stay there because as we kind of see with the episode with Amalia, it's like emotion and like connection to like these people is so stressful. Like the needs of the bureaucracy could not like bear like these people having like relationships with each other.
Too reactive, like too potent that if they get out into the outside uncontrolled world, like their presence is so potent that anything could happen. Like just them being around is a locus of power that could ignite.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, I feel like we've said most of what we have to say. So anybody have any like final thoughts on the castle? Anything else we want to say before we call it an evening here?
So I mean, I know in your recent episodes you've kind of done the like, does this belong in the Infinite Library? And I think it's like definitely a Kafka book belongs in there. It's hard for me to say which. I think he's absolutely essential. Just impossibly influential, and when you actually like, he's influential as you were saying because you hear about Kafka-esque before you ever read Kafka usually, and so then you go in with expectations, but when you actually read his writing, it's like, it's clear how incredibly influential he was in just that blend of, maddening, not only bureaucracy, but just any complex structures and sort of finding a way to live in something that makes absolutely no sense. So, in a sense, we could call it postmodern, looking at previous institutions or just sort of living in the beast. But I it's hard to say that this is the one that belongs there because it's incomplete and there are dangling threads. But I think at its best, like, it's maybe Kafka at his strongest. It's really like the prose is highly effective, and just like you actually, some of it is written for like an almost like a written for effect, where like when Kay is getting, just not even browbeaten, it's like a genial browbeating. He's just like when Burgle is just telling Kay, like, in the gentlest, most compassionate way, that like it is hopeless. Like the way that explanation just drags on, the sentences are so long, and Kay falls asleep in the middle. I think there are spots where you really get great emotional content from just like either identifying with the situation that someone is in, where they have nothing but bad options, but you have to choose something, and so you're stuck in this. I mean, that's the thing with, like, if we look at this as like a very anxious novel, that is the third option that comes up with anxiety. It's fight, flight, or freeze, and everyone in the town is frozen essentially. So the there's just a lot of like, there's a lot of funny stuff, but there's a lot of like very pitiable characters, just like they've had to like crush themselves just to not let the world like make them want to die anymore. So it's really hard for me to say if this would be the definitive work. I think maybe The Trial would be that one, just because it's complete and it hits a lot of the same stuff. But I think the heights he was going to reach, if this could have been like conclusively finished, I think this would have been an absolute, like, just, as you said earlier, opus, John. Because it really, like, the spiritual, emotional, social stuff is, I think, richer and more human than in The Trial. And that really bridges sort of what people think of as the shallow Kafkaesque with like a very effective novel.
Yeah. No, I think I kind of agree. I'm coming at this from the perspective of, this is the first Kafka I've read, and my gut feeling is that probably like something like The Trial is probably a better entry point if you're like me. I don't know if this is necessarily the best place to start with Kafka, but I think that like the weird status this book has, like the fact that it's unfinished kind of being like a Kafka-esque thing in and of itself kind of makes it,
it really is
kind of special in a way. It
has a really just outside the text effect on you, I think.
Like it has this aura to it because of that I think is very special. Even if, again, I think we're all kind of in agreement, we're maybe not a fan of like what the aura that this book is like kind of partially allowed people to turn Kafka like into. I do think that there is like something interesting there. I think too, I agree with you. I think if this is like mature Kafka, I think it's really a shame we didn't get either a complete version of this or like a different book that maybe brings in this more humanistic social element to his writing, and maybe kind of takes.
I mean,
takes
it's a pointless exercise,
level.
but can you imagine something that Kafka would have written? I mean, God, he probably wouldn't have actually seen the end of World War II as a Jew in, I guess, effectively the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. But like, God, Kafka after World War II, can you even imagine? Like, where would he have gone? Like,
oof.
Dan, did you say you started reading Bruno Schulz?
Breed of Crocodiles?
That's like, that
it is
coming to mind
on the shelf next to me, actually.
I think like it might resemble something like that because Bruno Schultz is sort of like in a similar situation, but his writing is a lot more fantastic. So maybe like, yeah, maybe kind of like a bare bones Bruno Schultz or something, like if he did survive until that point. I would say that I think you guys are right on the money in that like some Kafka needs to go into the Infinite Library. I don't know what. I do like, there's another essay I'm going to read because I did some secondary reading I'm going to talk about. William Gass has one called Kafka, Half Man, Half Metaphor. And it's written in the first person. And it's basically him taking on the speaker of Kafka to talk about how people always try to turn him into either something else. And he keeps talking about how he's like a bug. And like the person who's telling you this and like the bug wrote this or the bug said this. And in that one, he ends up saying like the letters are also really important because Kafka apparently wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters that are published in some places. I haven't read them myself, but I think like, I don't know. Yeah, I think something's got to go in there. I think, yeah, The Castle is a first time read. I think you yourself will be deterred by the, the circuit through the castle, and you may not end up even finishing it. But I think the cumulative effect is really important. And I don't think there's a lot of like quotable things from this either, which isn't to say that the prose is bad, but like you can't reduce it to a line or a sentence. And so I think, I would say maybe, I feel like I want to read more before I come down on The Castle, but I agree with the maybe. I would say like in terms of reading experiences, this has been my favorite of his. So maybe I'll put it in for there. But I think, it's hard to take something as representative.
Yeah, it's maybe not the most emblematic, but I think like it is the most Kafkaesque at its best, like.
That was Kafkaesque.
Italy's not that far from Czechoslovakia, I guess. But I think it is a stellar book through and through, but it's just in the company of other fantastic stuff he's written that's maybe a better entry point. Yeah. Or even just the aphorisms, like, because they are so effective in so few words.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun. Really,
absolutely.
Finally getting you on the pod.
To quote General MacArthur, I shall return.
Maybe we'll do that Street of Crocodiles next time.
Oh man, that'd be dope. Street of Crocodiles rocks.
There are so many things we could read.
We can continue our streak of crocodile themed books.
Yeah, Notes of a Crocodile, Street of a Crocodile, and then Crocodile 2, Son of Crocodile. So be the return.
Plus a special movie episode on Crocodile Dundee.
Yeah.
All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Dan, do you have anything you want to plug?
I have no plugs. I have no social media.
Fair enough.
Plug going in a big cave because I did that today, and I'm going to do it tomorrow too. So go into a big cave. I love you.
Go into a big cave. Turn into a bug. Kill yourself and kill everyone around you. The Infinite Library.
Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, Bookheads.